Welcome to Today in the World, where I'll be talking about news from around the world and giving you my thoughts. Before I get into any of the news stories, I just wanted to quickly go over some updates for Venezuela and also for Sudan. So, in Venezuela, probably around a dozen people have been killed, as well as 700 that have been arrested from the protests that have been happening after the presidential election where Nicolas Maduro claimed a third term. That is what's being reported anyway. The opposition leader, Maria Machado, just to clarify, she is not the candidate for president from the opposition, but she is the opposition leader. Anyway, she stated that according to the voter tallies from Sunday's election, they had 73% of the vote, but we haven't seen the voting data from the election, so it's unconfirmed as to how much votes each party has gotten. Nicolas Maduro has asked the Venezuelan Supreme Court to audit the presidential election because of the dispute. But, I mean, he's asking people that he either appointed or people who he helped get elected. So, I'm not really sure how. I don't see how people are going to find the decision that this Venezuelan Supreme Court comes to legitimate. I'll continue to update you on the Venezuelan situation as news filters out. In terms of the update for Sudan, there was an attack by 2 drones at a army graduation ceremony, attempting to kill the military leader, General Abdel Burhan. And just to refresh, there is a civil war happening in Sudan between the military leader and the leader of the RSF. I went over all of that in the previous video. So the attack ended up killing 5 people, and it comes after the RSF leader has said he plans to attend ceasefire talks in Geneva, Switzerland. The RSF has not commented on the assassination attempt yet. This is obviously going to negatively impact any ceasefire talks that take place now. It's going to be interesting to see how General Abdel Burhan responds to this. I don't imagine it's going to be positive, and I'm wondering if the cease talks will even take place anymore because of this. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, whether or not the RSF accepts responsibility for the assassination attempt, or if they just deny they were behind it at all. But either way, I think that this assassination attempt will be attributed to them, regardless of whether they've done it or not. Okay, and now I'm just going to get on to the news stories I wanted to talk about today. First off, it's going to be about the escalating tensions that are happening in the Middle East due to an Israeli strike in Tehran. We're going to move on from the tensions in the Middle East to protests in Nigeria because of, among many things, severe economic hardship in the country. We'll get into why there shouldn't be severe economic hardship in the country later on as well. And then I'm going to take a look at the situation in Myanmar because the military has extended their state of emergency for another 6 months. And they have stated the civil war as their reason, but apparently there's a little more than just the civil war as their reason. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the end of the Petro Dollar Deal because that's very important to the international scene. I haven't seen a lot of people talking about it, and it did happen 2 months ago, so I will talk about it today. It's not necessarily super recent news, but it's news I think is worth talking about. Okay, so tensions in the Middle East are only rising. Before I talk about tensions in the Middle East, I just want to say, first of all, I tend to find myself in the isolationist camp. So just like Ukraine, I don't think this is a situation that the West should be funding. I don't think this is a situation the West should be getting involved in. especially when we consider the recent allegations surrounding the Israeli armed forces, and especially when we consider that the other side are terrorists. So, you know, I'm not going to be talking about the allegations. I will give you a brief overview, but it's not really something I want to discuss. But basically, quickly summarize, there have been allegations that the Israeli military have been torturing their prisoners, among other things. These are all, I think they're just allegations right now. I think the torture is not. It's the other things that I believe are allegations right now. And it's the other things that I don't particularly want to talk about. So, if you're curious, it's definitely something you should search up. Because yikes. Aside from that, getting back toward the tensions in the Middle East, Israel has been suspected of killing Hamas's political leader who was in Tehran, violating the what's the word for it? Sorry. It's violating their superiority over their region. I forget what the word is. We'll come back to it when we talk about Egypt a little later on. But anyways, it has dampened the probability of ceasefire talks in the region, and the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has promised that he's going to continue the war against Hamas until total victory. The Hamas leaders were living in Qatar, but this particular one had come out to Iran for the inauguration of a new Iranian president. The Hamas leader was there, I presume, because they are backed by Iran. The supreme leader of Iran has talked about retribution for this attack, and many people are expecting a direct attack on Israel in response to the assassination. On top of increased tension with Iran, Israel is also prepared to expand its fight with a further offensive into Lebanon, if necessary, to directly attack Hezbollah, probably the strongest Iranian-backed terrorist group in the Middle East. And this is worrisome, especially because Lebanon and Israel have been shooting rockets at each other. So this would be escalating the situation dramatically. I know yesterday I said that I heard diplomats who were downplaying the threat of war in the region. But this really feels like it's a powder keg that will go off. I would be shocked if they found a way out of it without meetings. But that's not taking into consideration the fact that Donald Trump had managed the Abraham Accords. So I think that peace talks will be dependent on the outcome of the U.S. election. So it's, yeah. And the problem also in the Middle East is that a lot of those Middle Eastern countries do not like Israel. So any peace talks, it's hard to even get peace talks, and any peace talks tend to not be very productive. And if war does break out in the region, there's a very real chance that the United States will get involved because they're an ally of Israel, and they will probably pull a lot of Western countries into this war. Egypt has been speaking out about the condemning Israel's escalation. They haven't come out quite as far as saying they'll get involved, but they have been warning of consequences for violating the sovereignty of states. This is only going to further conflict in the region, and this does bring into question oil prices, because oil prices tend to jump as tensions rise, and it looks like they've increased around 3%. This won't have like a huge impact on anyone yet. And this just brings me back to the Canadian government and how I wish they would get their stuff together, because Canada could be very helpful on the world scene if they ever decided to do anything about their oil reserves, which are quite large. I know Germany's been outright asking for Canadian oil. I believe there have been some Eastern European countries that have been asking for it. But instead, we have an inept government who doesn't want to increase our oil production. And this leaves the Western world to rely on dictators to supplement existing stocks. Because as we know, dictators produce oil in an environmentally friendly way. So, go Canada! Yeah. I'm going to move on to Nigeria because honestly the Canada thing really just gets me going. The Nigerians have been planning a protest quite openly because of economic hardships, and the authorities are worried that these protests could mirror the 2020 demonstrations against police brutality, which led to violence. And they're comparing the possibility of violence in this current protest to the recent chaos in Kenya, where a tax hike had led to chaos in the Kenyan capital of Nairobi. The protests are set to happen on Thursday. And the reason I find the protests interesting is because they're protesting due to economic hardship. But on paper, Nigeria should be one of the more wealthy African nations because they are a top African oil producer. And yet their citizens are some of the poorest in the world. This... You can look at this and it's quite obvious why, because the politicians that run Nigeria are super corrupt and also they pay themselves very handsomely. So this is a very poor country where the government has struggled to create jobs and people are struggling to stay alive. It's a situation... Sorry. It's a situation where there are just inept and corrupt politicians who will promise change to a country that if they had politicians who were not corrupt and not inept, they would probably be a pretty wealthy African nation. And the government there has deployed security forces to major roads and cities in the country's capital, as well as other cities and the country's largest city. And the capital and the largest city are two different cities. Sadly, this is kind of what happens when you get a ruling class that don't know what they're doing. Because when they get there, they realize they have all this luxury and it's at no cost to themselves. So they often find it hard to give up this power and wealth that comes along with the position they're in. And it also becomes very hard to remove them from these positions because they don't want to go willingly. I think that's also very similar to the reason why Nicolas Maduro refuses to get out of office. But anyway, the government officials in Nigeria have been calling for the protests to halt, and this is the kicker. The security forces in Nigeria have been asking the protesters to only protest where they can be easily confined by said security forces. And I don't know in what world they expect the protesters to agree with that. But it's not this world. I would be blown away if the protesters were like, yeah, okay, we'll go somewhere where we can be easily confined. It's ridiculous. All right. Yeah, that's all I've got to say about Nigeria. It's... Yeah, they could be doing a lot better there. Like a lot of countries, actually. But Myanmar. Myanmar currently has a military government. They seized power, I believe it was 2020 or 2021, where they led a coup against the democratically elected government. And I was going to say more on that, but I'm just going to skip over it. They've repeatedly promised to hold elections there, but the elections have been delayed by states of emergency, and they seem to always be extending the states of emergency. The newest extension is supposed to run till January 31st, 2025. They are battling opposition groups. Okay, so Myanmar, they currently have a military government that's extending the states of emergency, and they're battling their opposition, and they're really struggling to stop this, what people are calling civil war. Their opposition is basically um, a bunch of ethnic minority armed groups. There's also the People's Defense Force, or the People's Democratic Force, that are basically they're fighting obviously for democracy in their country, hence the name. They've recently suffered a series of losses to these groups, and it's weird because you would think the military would be better able to fight, but I suppose this would be good news to people who are always fighting for gun rights, because yeah, it's not like a super sophisticated military, but the militant groups are holding their own against the state military. So it's a good example, I think. But anyway, this military junta had seized power, and they set a 2-year state of emergency because of what they were calling terrorist attacks. And then the state of emergency has now been extended another 6 months. So they keep pushing the state of emergency extension for various reasons, and they keep promising to hold elections. As I said before, they had extended this one because of the Civil War, but also because they wanted to carry out a census of the population. I get the second reason. I suppose the first one doesn't make sense, because if they called for an actual fair election, then obviously they wouldn't have opposition groups. But the second one, the population census, that one actually makes sense, because there have been, I think it's been reported, around 7 million people who left the country due to the war. So I at least understand why they want to have a population census before. But anyway, many people are suggesting that the proposed polls will be neither free nor fair, because the military junta has stacked the election commission. And I've been looking at this just at face value, because obviously the elections are not going to be free and fair. Because if they're planning free and fair elections, you don't need to keep delaying a so-called free and fair election. Obviously, they're looking to stack the election in their favor. And just off the top of my head, whenever there's been a military coup of a government, I don't think I can think of a single time where the military who couped the government was like, we're going to have free and fair elections, and then actually had free and fair elections. I could be missing a prime example of this, and if I am, please comment or send me an email, because I would be absolutely floored if that has happened before. And I'm also honestly kind of curious if that ever has happened. And I'm going to get on to what I consider the most important story, even though it's a little old, the petrodollar story. So Saudi Arabia has chosen not to renew the petrodollar deal, and they're instead allowing their goods, oil, to be sold in various currencies like the euro and yen. It's really important because this is going to change the U.S. superpower status on the global stage, and this will impact the U.S. dollar. The deal hasn't officially ended, but what's happened is they let the deal expire, and then they have not really talked about renewing it, either party. I haven't heard anything about them talking about renewing it. It's really going to negatively affect the U.S. if there is no petrodollar deal, because Saudi has been selling its crude oil in U.S. currency, and this has greatly helped the U.S. dollar's international standing, and it's one of the key reasons that the U.S. dollar has been the international standard for decades. Because Saudi Arabia had standardized its oil in terms of dollars, there have been several other oil-producing countries that have also standardized their prices. And it's meant that foreign countries have had to keep a reserve of U.S. cash on hand, so that they could buy energy from Saudi Arabia or some of these other U.S. or other oil-producing countries, and that's actually why Russia had a bunch of U.S. currency. because it's been treated as the international standard, and this has allowed the U.S. to apply economic pressure on countries instead of just going to war with them or supporting a proxy war against them. It's how the U.S. has maintained its global superpower status. So this definitely will hurt the U.S. on the international scale. It's also going to affect the U.S. economy because the U.S. economy relies quite heavily on foreign countries' need for U.S. dollars to purchase oil. And there's speculation that if the deal is not renewed, it could mean that Americans are looking at a depression, especially when you consider the economy right now in America is not fantastic. So more shocks to the system could be disastrous. And because the U.S. was providing military support and security guarantees to Saudi Arabia, the Saudis had agreed to invest oil revenue in U.S. assets, primarily treasury securities that had helped finance U.S. deficits to stabilize the U.S. dollar. So if the U.S. does hit net economic depression because the current administration allows the deal to fall apart, it could potentially lead to a rise of unemployment and poverty, and a rise in homelessness. And it's already not great for consumers in the U.S., so this would make it worse. It's definitely something that the current president should push for renewing. It's something that the next president should push for renewing, because as of right now, Saudi can sell their oil to whatever currency, in whatever currency they want, and it's only going to lead to more oil-producing countries to follow their lead. If I've missed any international stories, please let me know. I can be reached via my email, todayintheworld2024@gmail.com, or you can just leave a comment in the comment section of wherever you watch this. Also, if you're wondering where I get my news, a lot of it comes from Ground News, and the rest of it comes from X. You'll see a lot of unconfirmed rumors and whatnot floating around X, and I always have to be cautious about that. I do not use Google News. Google is insane. They are absolutely censoring stories, so I can't use Google. I hope this was informative and that you listen to me next time. I will continue to monitor stories and let you know what's happening in the world today.